Well, welcome everybody to our next conversation. I'm delighted and honoured to welcome Dr. Wayne Visser. Um, Wayne, you're very welcome and thank you for your time.
Good to be with you.
Can I call you Wayne? Is that all right, or shall I?
Yes, of course. Yeah, that's what my mother calls me, so you're welcome.
Of course. So today we're going to be talking about Wayne's new book, which is being published as we speak and will be released early next year. Is there a date for publishing?
Yeah, 15th of February, but available for pre-order now.
Fantastic. There's going to be a link, so if anybody wants to download and pre-order. So the book is about the breakthrough movement to regenerate nature, society and the economy. And Wayne's got an impressive history, not only of speaking to many people across the globe, but you've written 40 books on the subject of circularity and regenerative thinking. I haven't read them all. I've read your latest book, which is fascinating. And what I like about it is your positive, optimistic view of how we can fix climate change and reverse the destruction that we're causing to the planet. And you share lots of fantastic examples, which, let's face it, we need hope, don't we?
Absolutely. I think we face a crisis of pessimism and despair, and we see that not least among our young people today. And there is some cause for that, but I have framed a lot of my work and a lot of what I see in terms of what's possible, what's really happening, and also how systems change, which I'm sure we'll get into. And all of that gives me a great reason for hope. Even coming out of COP26 of Glasgow, where many think that was a failure, I actually come out feeling quite positive about the direction and the speed of travel.
Certainly the narrative is now changing, isn't it? And the leaders around the world are certainly aware of what needs to be done, but we don't have much time, do we? Maybe 10, 20 years to correct the imbalance and the consumption of fossil-based fuels. I'm going to start off our conversation with a question I ask everybody, and that's what do you like doing when you're not writing, traveling and speaking, and writing poetry, which I know is one of your passions?
That's one of the things. And funnily enough, I do find writing itself therapeutic, not always the formal writing, the nonfiction, but poetry. And I keep a journal. I have done for more than 30 years now. And the physical act of writing I find quite meditative. So that's one of the things I do. But anything about getting out into nature is really the way that I rejuvenate. And so walking, especially in forests, is something that really does it for me. And spending time with loved ones, I think these are the important things in life.
And in terms of the places that you visited around the world, where would be the I know you've got to some, because you were brought up in South Africa, weren't you? Where's the high point for you?
Yeah, and this is such a tough question, right? So I was born, in fact, in Zimbabwe, grew up in South Africa, lived a good deal of my life there, been in the UK and Belgium the last 15 years or so. But I have traveled now to 77 countries. So to pick a favorite is really tough, but let me try. So I think that in terms of, let's say, intellectual fascination, it's probably Egypt. That's just such an amazing place to try and get your head around. And then in terms of real inspiration, I would say it's a visit I was lucky enough to have to a community in the Amazon rainforest, an Ashwa community, and literally isolated in the forest. Takes them more than a week of boats and walking to get to the nearest road, and just seeing how they're living. It's not an idyllic existence necessarily. I mean, they are poor, but they are living also in harmony with nature, and getting to experience that philosophy that they have of the earth being alive and needing to be respected. And because I absolutely love forests, that this was an amazing experience, which I write about in the book as well. And then if I have to just say, do I have a soul place? That probably is Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe, one of the most amazing natural wonders of the world, called by the local indigenous population Museo Tunya, which means the smoke that thunders. And it really is an amazing place to visit and to be. And I've had many wonderful adventures there from when I was very young to more recently, including something I'll never repeat, which is bungee jumping off one of the highest bridges in the world, and also whitewater rafting and nearly drowning in the Zambezi. So all wonderful memories and associations with that place.
Because you nearly drowned, didn't you, when you were younger?
Yes, I say I nearly drowned in the Zambezi. That's not quite true. It felt like I was drowning because I did go off the very rough rapids, and I did end up under the water. But I was wearing a jacket and very quickly got retrieved. But no, more seriously, my wife and I very, very nearly did drown in South Africa off the coast. And we got caught by a riptide. And that's actually the opening story of my book, because it really gets one reflecting on what's important in life, but also there are some insights into our human condition, because funnily enough, on this beach, people think I'm crazy, but it's true. On this beach, which is called Sadwana Bay, there's a sign, a warning of risks, and there were 4 risks that they warned of. One was crocodiles, another was hippos, the third was sharks, and the fourth was the tide. And of course, that's actually not that unusual in Africa to have those sort of signs. It just means you've got to keep your wits about you. And the one we underestimated was probably the one that was the deadliest, which is the tide. And so I write about how we're also ignoring some of the most dangerous risks today, because they're sort of half invisible and happening slowly, and we need to pay more attention.
So as you know, I've watched this a couple of times. You made a documentary back in 2018-19 called Closing the Loop, and you talk about circularity and the relevance of circularity in practical terms. Why did you make that documentary?
More or less for the same reason as why I wrote the book Thriving, and that's because we're in desperate need of solutions. There are plenty of books and documentaries out there about the problems, and I just got tired of all the doom and gloom. And it's important that we are informed of the challenges and the scale and urgency of those challenges. But we need the focus on innovations and changes and solutions that can get us out of the mess. And working now for more than 30 years in sustainability, it's just become more and more obvious, as I say in the opening to that documentary, that unless we go to circular, it's game over for the planet and it's game over for society. I mean, it really is scientifically true that you just cannot continue the way we're continuing with a a growth and consumption trajectory on a finite planet. It just doesn't add up. So the only way that we get out of that dilemma is by going circular, by which we mean that energy and materials need to be in constant, continuous and closed loop flows. If something's made from a natural material, it needs to go harmlessly back to nature. And if it's made from a technical or an artificial material, it needs to go back into production. And it's as simple as that. And yet less than 10% of the world's products today are circular. And you don't find any politicians or CEOs promising to go for zero or negative growth. So in the absence of that, we really have to scale up the circular economy and make it a solution for everyone, not just for rich folks up in the West or the North, but for everybody.
So will you make more documentaries? Because I know you've written 41 books now, I think. Thriving, that makes it 41.
Yes, Thriving is the 41st book. And just to correct your intro, they're not all on sustainability and circularity, because some of them are indeed poetry books, and there's a few fiction books in there as well. But the majority, of course, are about the main subject that I'm concerned about, which is how we change the world, and especially use business as a positive force to do that. But on the documentary side, I really am keen to do a documentary on thriving, or we may call it a regeneration, because I think we're entering such a critical decade where we have the opportunity to turn around this crisis of breakdowns. I talk in the book about 6 major breakdowns that we see in society and how those need to turn into breakthroughs. One of the ones that I think we're making the least progress on is ecosystem breakdowns. We have lost 2/3 of our wildlife populations in 50 years. What took 3.8 billion years to build up, we've taken 1 generation to wipe out. And yet we see companies now really starting to get it, and governments, and realizing first that climate and nature, biodiversity, are intimately linked, but also that our human well-being, our prosperity in the end, is also very tightly linked to ecosystems, to nature that functions. And at the moment we see rapid breakdown. So we get lots of companies promising now to invest huge sums of money, billions, to begin to restore nature. Of course, out of COP26, the climate meeting in Glasgow, we've got a deforestation agreement covering 85% of the world's forests, where around about 100 countries are committing to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030, so within 8 years effectively. And that's really exciting. Even if we don't get all the way there, that means a lot of action is going to happen on the ground. A lot of money is going in to restoring nature, to changing to regenerative agriculture. Some of the big players like Danone committing to this, other big players like, the Bezos Earth Fund or Unilever putting billions into these projects. So I'm really keen to do a little bit like I did with Closing the Loop, which is visit different parts of the world and just, find out what's going on the ground and whether it's working. And see also where those positive stories are, where we are turning things around so that we can learn from each other.
I know a lot of your work is focused on large companies like Coca-Cola and Unilever, etc. But you also work with young people, don't you? You lecture at Cambridge University and at Antwerp Management School, where I know you play very much a leadership role there. How do we engage younger people? Because I've got a 21-year-old son. He doesn't read words that easily, you'd much prefer to watch a film or watch a YouTube clip. How do we engage younger people to be more curious, learn the facts, and discover, what they can do to contribute?
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing about the younger people, I think in many ways today, they are more informed than the adults, and they're taking more leadership than the adults. And so, we can help to guide them. And it is important that we find modes to do that, whether that be, the sort of TikTok generation approach where you really need to get messages across in a very creative and a succinct way, or podcasts, or, even creative avenues like, the artists, the singers, the dancers, and the filmmakers. I think all of those are a bit more accessible for young people, but I also think we shouldn't underestimate how concerned and curious and informed young people are today. What seems to be missing is that link to, the hope and the avenues of action that will make a real difference. And I think the problem is, that many people are in this trap that we think we have to change the world, when in fact what we have to do is change our world. We have to influence what we can in our very local environment. So yes, we have to take action, and there are many things that young people, but also adults, can do. And I see that among many of the people I interact with. They're making choices around their diets. They're going plant-based. They're making choices around the companies that they work for. They don't want to work for a company they don't feel proud of, or that they think is part of the problem rather than the solution. There are whole industries that I, advise in some way that are seeing this as a crisis. They're struggling to attract the best talent because they are unable to show themselves as being really purpose-led, as having a positive contribution to society. So, they're making choices around what they consume, how they buy, so more aware of, is it fair trade, is it organic, and even transportation, do I need a car? Probably not. Whereas my generation, it was just assumed once you grow up, you save up and you get a car, or maybe your parents even give you one if you're lucky. Now it's like, why would I get a car? So I think those choices are being made, but the gap is in the understanding that making those choices and putting their pressure in all the ways that they can, in fact, will and is causing the system to tip in a positive way. And that's what's missing, and that's why there's so much despair. We call it actually now eco-anxiety and climate anxiety, and it's very real, and it's sad, and it needs to now fuel the action and the belief that we can actually turn this ship around.
I mean, the frustration of young people, Greta Thunberg's, etc., is palpable, isn't it? That activism approach, which we're seeing more and more of course, not just with young people, but various sections of society. What's your view of activism? Because I know that your view, you've taken a very much an optimistic, solution-led approach. But what's your view of activism to jolt leaders into action?
I think activism is absolutely necessary. In fact, very few systems or societies change fundamentally without activism. So we need that pressure, and we should be celebrating it and supporting it and joining it in any way that we can, because until those in power feel that pressure, they typically don't let go of that power or change their behavior. That's just how the world has always worked. And so I think we need that alongside everything else that is being done, such as innovation through business, such as increasingly strong and clear policy, such as the market doing its thing with driving down prices of solutions like clean technologies. All of these things work together and reinforce one another to create these positive tipping points where the whole system can change. But really, we need to encourage social activism, and of the kind that we've seen, whether that's Extinction Rebellion or the climate strike movement or Black Lives Matter, or indeed the Sunrise Movement in the United States, calling for the Green New Deal and things like that. So we've got to distinguish that from what sometimes is called slacktivism, which is, where you just basically click a like on your Facebook or your LinkedIn for a cause that you enjoy or support, or perhaps you sign a petition that's going around the internet. I mean, that doesn't do it. That's not enough. It really has to be in some way visible, disruptive. And, if we ask ourselves, is that making a difference? The frustration that they feel often is that they're not being heard. We saw that at Glasgow, 100,000 people protesting, more in 100 cities around the world, and saying, well, if you were hearing us, we would see bolder action, we would see you going further, faster. But I know for a fact, because I work with a lot of leaders in business mainly, they are being heard and they are changing their behavior in pretty radical ways. And it just takes a little bit of time for those adjustments to come through. If you think about innovation, you need to invest, in some cases, multi-billion-dollar investments to change things. But they are feeling that pressure, and it shouldn't relent either. We need to keep it up.
But we need policy change as well, don't we? We need a taxation system globally that encourages the investment in green tech, and a much more regenerative, circular approach to doing business. And without those incentives, because at the moment the gas and oil industry is subsidized, and until we remove those subsidies, why should people invest in green tech?
Yeah. Well, firstly, the remarkable thing is, even with those subsidies, solar and wind now are the cheapest source of new energy in almost every country of the world. As you start to remove those subsidies, and there is a commitment now through the Glasgow Pact to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. Some countries have already committed to get rid of them completely in very short time frames. So that is happening. And then you do indeed need to get the other incentives right. You need to tax in some way the things you don't want, like pollution, like carbon emissions. That's a bit patchy how it's happening, but it is happening. And I think the thing with policy is that it is an enabler. It's something that accelerates change. And so if we can get it, we should really welcome it, and we should ask for it, but we shouldn't wait for it. We shouldn't wait for all the countries of the world to agree and everybody to have a carbon tax. Politics is messy, and usually politicians don't lead, they follow. And what they follow is...
They're in transition, aren't they? So
they are. And well, of course, I mean, all politicians are short-term, business leaders are short-term, but they do listen to what's changing in society. They're very aware of how voter habits or future employee habits are changing. And so once again, I do believe they feel that pressure, and they start to have some really bold legislation. If you look in Europe, of course, the European Green Deal, there's some real ambition in there. And what's happening more and more, as we saw in Glasgow, is this becomes the basis for others getting into coalitions and alliances, and upping the ante. So it becomes a virtuous cycle. And this is also an understanding of how change happens. Nobody really wants to be left behind. And so once it becomes the trendy thing to do and the expected norm, then suddenly, we see people adopting it. Not very long ago, we were still only talking about keeping it to 2 degrees warming. Now, if you're not talking about 1.5 maximum warming, you're just out of step. We were talking about net zero by 2050. Now, if you're not talking about halving your emissions by 2030, you're just not keeping up. And so this is contagious in a positive way. And we see that.
But the gas and oil industry and the coal sector are continuing to extract. And if my facts are correct, they're planning over the next 25 years, 400% growth. Now, that doesn't seem to make sense when we're trying to keep fossil fuels in the ground to reduce CO2 emissions.
Well, of course, their argument is that they need the revenues from that legacy business to fund the transition to the new low carbon or renewable energy future. But I think they're going to get caught out as well. I think it's the system is going to change much faster than they think, and they will have stranded assets. I fully believe that there is still a massive carbon bubble which will burst, and some will be ready enough that they can quickly adapt. I mean, if you look at a BP or a Shell, at least they've been open to investing in renewables. BP saying that they'll sell 40% less fossil fuels by 2030, which is unprecedented. Both Shell and BP actually have the largest electric vehicle charging network in Europe now. So they're hedging their bets, and they will move much more quickly when they can see the industry collapsing around them. But they will. Some of them will be stranded, and it'll be.
They ask for your guidance at all? Any of these oil and gas companies?
Sure. I mean, I've done work for the European Petrochemicals Association, work on sustainability leadership. My chair in Antwerp Management School, one of my chair partners is BASF. Okay, it's not an oil and gas, but it's a chemical company. And they are all wrestling with this, and some are being more ambitious than others. They certainly have the awareness of the change that's coming. So the only debate is about how far, how fast. And this is again where we have to look at how the system changes. And if we get those positive feedback loops happening, the reinforcing effects, the convergence between the social pressure, the political policy reforms, the market incentives as these technologies scale and become cheaper. You combine all of those things, and then it does, incentivize them to make that shift faster. I lived through that South African transition from apartheid racist system to democracy. And what you see is, in this case, 40 years of an atrocious system of human abuse and resistance to change right up until, the 11th hour. And then when the change starts to happen and it becomes obvious that it's inevitable, the change is incredibly fast. And then after the change, rather strangely, you can never find anyone who ever supported the previous system. Yeah. Because nobody wants to be left behind. We're social animals. And this is what we're in the midst of now, this accelerating change. And so You know, I was speaking to one of the CEOs just the other day, last week, I think. And he said he's frustrated because he thinks the demands are unrealistic, and this is not how complex industrial business works. We need to invest in research and development. It takes time. We have to put billions in, build new plants and so on. But what he said is that what's totally obvious right at this moment is that the pressure is so high and the inevitability is so certain, it means he has to make those big investment decisions today. He can't put them off any longer because it's still going to take a few years for them to be realized. And I think that's what we're seeing. And many of the commitments we saw coming out of Glasgow were a sign of that finally both business and finance, importantly, is really ready now to put their weight behind this. $130 trillion now lined up behind the transition to net zero. That is 40% of all the money that is available in the world today. So imagine the impact that's going to have. All of the big banks in the world, top 10 in Europe, top 10 in America, top 6 in Latin America, all are going to go to their corporate clients and say, give me your plan to net zero. And it has to be science-based, it has to be credible, it has to have a 2030 target, probably of halving emissions by 2030. I mean, the kind of knock-on effects that this has will be stunning. And we'll see it in other areas like electric cars will come much faster than people think. It's not that we'll solve everything in this decade, but we will see a huge amount of change.
Just changing tack slightly, in your book, Thriving, you refer to creative disruptors, which I count myself as one of those, as weeds. I love that term. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, there are a number of reasons for that. Entrepreneurs are tough. They're often scruffy in the sense that they don't fit in, they don't conform, and that is why they're entrepreneurs. And also they grow on the margins, right? Weeds, what we call weeds, are often just wild flowers, by the way, and they tend to grow on the fringes, and that's where change is happening. It's where the earth is dug up or is exposed. And so, this is the way that innovation happens in society and in ecosystems as well. It's always, in this, what appears to be a messy way, but it's that very messiness that allows the emergence to happen, the creativity and the innovation. Most of all, they're tenacious. Right, an Edison, I can't remember the number exactly, but he invented 10,000 filaments before the one that finally worked, and that's the kind of dogged determination that we need from our entrepreneurs, and we see from them.
Sticking with the nature, what we can learn from nature. You talk about sudden shifts in behaviour and how quickly people adapt to new technology and circumstances in order to survive and thrive. How might this be relevant? And what can we learn from nature? And examples where nature has adapted and thrived.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is, if you give nature the space, it will thrive automatically. That is the natural state of the world and of life, is thriving. And what we've done is we've been the virus on this planet. We've destroyed nature, and we've made it really hard. If you look at our agricultural fields, of which I'm surrounded by, these are deserts where we've killed off all the life. But as soon as you just give that little bit of space and time, nature bounces back incredibly quickly. And we saw that in the first days of the pandemic, right, where there were serious lockdowns, and suddenly, nature was bouncing back. You can take more extreme examples like Chernobyl, right? So that's been deserted now. It's a toxic wasteland full of radioactivity, but nature has been coming back since that disaster. And we've seen as well, as soon as you protect a little bit, such as the marine zones and the ban on whaling, although it still happens with a few countries like Japan. But whale numbers bounced back incredibly fast, and so we see this, but we do need to give it the time and the space to adapt and to come back. And it's the same with societies. Many societies are suffering, many are still poor. But like I did an interview with Mohammed Yunus once, the founder of the Grameen Bank, and he was saying, we sometimes say we've got to lift people out of poverty. And he said that's not really true. All you have to do, they're basically locked in a cage of poverty. All you have to do is open the door and people will come out by themselves. And he's got another lovely analogy I read recently. He said, basically, poor people are like bonsai trees. So it's not that they can't grow, it's just that we've contained them in this very small pot. If you were to plant them in the garden and let them flourish, they would become massive, great flourishing trees. So a lot of this is about taking away the barriers to thriving, which is a natural state for humans and for nature.
There's obviously going to be a sort of shift in responsibility between the north and south of the globe. Do you think that reparations or taxation may be a method of redistributing wealth, given that the north of the globe is consuming the bulk of the fossil fuel requirements, but the south is actually suffering the consequences of those emissions? How do you think we'll redress that balance fairly?
Well, I think that needs to happen and is starting to happen. It was one of the breakthroughs in the Glasgow Pact. The agreement was for the first time to put not only adaptation and funds for adaptation, but also damage and reparation onto the agenda. So, basically what we're saying, although it hasn't been agreed how and how much, there is a moral duty for the North and the West, for the rich countries that have benefited from the extraction of fossil fuels and who are affected less than the poor world, to pay, to help them cope, to help them survive and get through this transition, and also to enable them with technology, to make that transition more quickly. We see an example now of South Africa, some money billions being put aside to help South Africa make that journey, because it's very dependent on coal, and we need to see that in many other countries as well. So at this stage, it's a kind of voluntary tax, if you like, and we'll have to see if that goes far enough. But certainly we need far more responsibility taken by the rich world to share resources, to share knowledge, to share technology, and of course, to share finances. What's interesting in the case of climate change, of course, is that a lot of the solutions are in the developing countries. If you look at nature-based solutions, I mean, the big tropical rainforests of the world are in Brazil, the Congo, and Indonesia. It's money very well spent if we help those countries to conserve and restore those forests. Probably much better spent than on carbon capture and storage technology at this stage. And so that's just an example of many that we could just help. By helping those countries, we help ourselves. Unfortunately, we're a selfish breed, selfish species, let's say. humans, and we've seen that with the COVID crisis, right? With the West, with the rich countries hoarding the vaccines, and then we're surprised when the poor countries are struggling. And so we do need to keep the pressure up for a more equitable, fair distribution of resources and rewards for protecting nature especially, but also for development.
What's your view on carbon capture and storage? Do you think is that a substitute option, or is that an option we should be considering now and going full steam ahead?
Oh, we have to have it as one of the tools in our kit of solutions, for sure. It will be a solution for many of the heavy industries. It won't necessarily be an excuse to just continue as before. At the moment, it's still very, very expensive and still largely unproven at the scale that we need it. And as I said, nature-based solutions at the moment are far more efficient, but we need to invest in the full range of solutions, of which CCS will be one. We have a whole another area, which is, how you can not just capture carbon and store it underground, for example, but how you can increasingly turn it into a product. So storage and usage. And I think that will be a very strong trend to actually turn what is negative carbon into positive carbon. Unilever has a lovely diagram, which they call the carbon rainbow. And what we talk about when we talk about carbon is black carbon. It's the bad stuff when you let it out as gas into the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas. But carbon is the basis for life. I mean, there are many uses of carbon that are positive, and what we've got to do now is take the negative carbon, the black carbon, and turn it into this rainbow or other types of carbon which are actually good for society and for nature. And I think we can do that. We're an innovative species. Direct air capture, which is another related technology, where we're going to try and suck it out of the air, literally. I think that one at the moment might be a solution, but at the moment is still very, very small scale. So there are smarter things we can do. The ocean absorbs 2/3 of the carbon already. And if you look at something like restoring seagrass or growing seaweed, kelp, these things grow very, very effectively. Seagrass absorbs 30 times what a tropical rainforest absorbs. And something like kelp can grow extremely fast and absorbs a lot of carbon and can be then taken, either used in food or sunk to the bottom of the ocean. So there are much smarter ways than just pure carbon capture and storage. It will be one of the solutions, but in the short term, not the most efficient or effective one at the scale that we need.
So you met a lot of people on your travels, Wayne. Who do you most admire and why?
My heroes or my role models tend to be intellectual heroes. I must say, I didn't meet, but I had encounters with on 2 occasions with Nelson Mandela, and it's hard not to be inspired by somebody like that. But I think the people that have really inspired me have tended to be those that are at the forefront of seeing the changes that we need. So somebody like Fritjof Capra, who for years has been at the leading edge of systems thinking and the science of that. People like that have always inspired me. In the business sphere, there are people like John Elkington, Paul Hawken, Stuart Hart, more from the academia side. These are all people that I think have been been pioneers, Janine Benyus on biomimicry. There's lots of inspiration out there that I take heart from. I try to remind myself, of course, that none of us should aspire to be anyone else. We just need to be the best version of ourselves. But of course, we can be inspired by others and the ways in which, for me, it's the ways in which ideas can and do change the world. That's what inspires me, and I see that with some of these people.
And so, what are you reading at the moment? And of the books that you've read, which has been the most life-changing for you?
Tough question. For one thing, I never ever only read one book at a time. So I think I'm reading, I was counting the other days, between 6 and 8. Let's see how many I get to when I tell you. So in fact, in parallel, I've been reading Breaking Boundaries by Johan Rockström, and that's all about the planetary boundaries, the science of the Earth. Really, really fantastic. I've been reading The Book of Hope by Jane Goodall. I'm reading Regeneration by Paul Hawken, and I'm reading Net Positive by Paul Pullman and Andrew Winston. So those are kind of the heavy books, if you like, the serious books. I'm sort of halfway through Entangled Life, which is all about the fungi, science of the fungi in our natural world, which is also fascinating. That's Rupert Sheldrake. And then I try to always have some fiction on the go as well. And so, I'm reading, I like science fiction actually. So I'm reading Ready Player 2, which is just a sort of a future of the sort of virtual reality, really. And then I'm reading a book by Isaac Asimov as well at the moment, and one by Ben Okri, which is more of a poetic prose piece like he writes. I'm reading some Tales from Norfolk. So, I mean, I can go on and on, but I have a huge stack next to my bed. But in terms of what's been life-changing, I mean, all of these are excellent, especially those first 4 I was telling you. Those are sort of the books of our time and our moment. I do think some of the books by Fridtjof Capra for me were pretty life-changing. I mean, like The Turning Point. Before that, he had The Tao of Physics, because this was really about how systems thinking was changing society. Before that, there was one called The Aquarian Conspiracy. This is back in the 1980s, which again was about how brain-mind science was reshaping our understanding of how the world really works. But I think that in terms of life-changing, some of Ben Okri's books I think I just find so inspiring. He has books like Mental Fight, which are really books of poetry, really, but are so insightful. So I don't know. It's hard to choose. Every book changes me in a way, both those that I read and those that I write.
Well, look, wonderful. Wayne, it's been a pleasure to meet you and spend some time with you. You really have an amazing brain, and you also have the uncanny ability to communicate it very clearly, which is, I think, quite a skill. So thank you very much. I've really appreciated your time.
Thank you. It's been nice to be in conversation. This is what we need more of, is dialogue. So thank you for hosting, and let's stay in touch. Well, Ian, one of the things I like to do is bring some creativity into the room in any conversation. And I do this actually with lectures and with keynotes to business audiences. And that's that I normally share a bit of poetry. I'm not only a professor, but as you noted, a poet as well. And somehow it engages a different part of the brain. So since we've been talking about my new book, Thriving, I thought I'd just end with one of my poems called Thriving. So see what you make of this. Our life is so much more than a duty or a chore of merely getting by without a why or what for, the law of tooth and claw, the struggle to exist, to rally and resist against life's slow decay, the way of entropy, of living just to see another day, to stay, to endure and survive. No, life is meant to thrive. In nature, all things grow from seed to tree. We know the cycle of living through giving, of reap and sow, the flow. Things come and go, the cycles of grooming from sprouting to blooming, of stretching for the light, the bright palette of hope, the diverse ways to cope, to cherish and flourish, bursting forth and alive. For nature means to thrive. Society lives too, a melting pot we brew from cultures and crises with spices for flavor and kindness to savor, ideas for conceiving and goals for achieving that stretch us and bind us, that find us together in all kinds of weather, wanting what's fair to care, longing to love and strive for society to thrive. The markets live and breathe in complex webs we weave. The synapses of trade have made the things we need, each deed a chance to lead, while tech is getting smart, yet still it needs a heart, a compass as a guide to tide us through the storm and find a better norm, a breakthrough to renew, an innovation drive. Yes, markets too can thrive. All life is meant to rise, to reach up to the skies, to move beyond the edge, to fledge with hopeful cries. Life tries until it flies. It shakes and spreads its wings and trills each note it sings. While given time and space, the race of life is run, full powered by the sun, on land, in seas, like bees, sweet nectar from the hive. All life is made to thrive.